A conference entitled The Central Intelligence Agency and World Peace was held in New Haven, Connecticut, on the campus of Yale University. From the evening session of the conference, Col Fletcher Prouty talks of his experiences with the CIA. Col Prouty is a former liaison officer between the Defense Department and the CIA. Fletcher Prouty.
As far back as 1943, I went into Saudi Arabia on what was then termed a clandestine operation. It was a rather modest affair. But if you can remember, in the latter part of 1943, the country was planning to meet, Roosevelt was planning to meet with Churchill and with Chiang Kai-shek in Cairo. To add a little flavor to their meeting and perhaps to underscore its pertinency to today's headlines, they sent a team into Saudi Arabia where they were just beginning to discover that there was a lot of petroleum. And a fourth world leader took part in the Cairo conference that few people either knew about or recall, and he was King Ibn Saud. Shortly thereafter, we went up to Tehran, to the Tehran conference, and we met with Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. And the world press read that China was not represented there because Russia was not at war officially with Japan, and it would be improper to have China there. In other words, we were getting used to telling people what we wanted them to believe instead of what was actually going on, because I happened to be the pilot of the airplane that flew the Chinese to Tehran. In 1944, I did a lot of work in Turkey, because we found out that there was a gold smuggling ring of tremendous proportions, moving gold from Germany right through the lines, and somehow it was getting to Latin America. And I think we've all read since then what a tremendous amount of gold was moved through that area and the effect it has had upon relations with Latin America and certain other world powers since that time. We went into Turkey to try to break that ring, and eventually it was. Some of you remember a movie actor named Bruce Cabot. He was one of the men that was wrapped up in it. I went up into Russia later that year on an operation that had to do really with what we call shuttle bombing, or the lack thereof, since all the bombers were destroyed on the ground by the German Air Force. And in sending so many planes in there, we thought it'd be a good chance to get a little intelligence. So we slipped an extra plane in to do some map filling. There were too many blanks in the Russian maps, and we didn't know enough about the country. And in a rather amateur way, they equipped the plane, which I flew into the Soviet Union up around Kiev from Tehran. So again, it was part of the growing move toward that kind of activity. In August of '45, I was among those who went into Tokyo at the time of the surrender, flew back by going over Hiroshima and landed in Okinawa. And in Okinawa, saw them loading ships, as many as they could, in that famous harbor that had been at Naha, that had been bombed by the kamikazes so frequently. And on going down to the docks to see what was going on, we found that tons and tons and boatloads of supplies that had been brought to Okinawa for the Japanese invasion and would not be needed were being shipped southward, being shipped to a harbor whose name in those days we hardly knew, called Haiphong. And from Haiphong they would be delivered to Hanoi to a colonel whose name I happen to remember. It was Giap. And Giap's boss was a man named Ho Chi Minh. And the reason we were dividing the mountains of supplies on Okinawa between Korea on one hand and Indochina on the other was that we had, through the OSS, the precursor of the CIA, contact with Ho Chi Minh in the name of a major general named Gallagher. And General Gallagher had received authority to bring more than 10 complete divisions of equipment into Haiphong for delivery to General Giap, whom the French were fighting not too many years later. But these are some of the things that help you put into perspective how our country began to internationalize clandestine efforts. I had the real pleasure to come home from Okinawa and find orders that sent me here to Yale. And I taught here at Yale for 3 years with what was then the first days of the Air Force's ROTC program. I think some of the people that were in our classes in those days have participated in things now that they look back on those days, quite a different program than we run in the years since. I left here because I went on into the Korean War, and here again we supported activities such as airdrops in the Chinese area. We supported activities in the Philippines that were, as I mentioned this afternoon to some of you, that led to the election of Magsaysay. This was a major operation run by the CIA. We flew the Magsaysay team, as we call them, into Saigon to support President Diem as he got started, and as some of you have read in the Pentagon papers, it was called the Saigon Military Mission. Of course, there were no military in the military mission. That was just its name, as most of the activities in Vietnam were named military activities up through about 1963, when finally the escalation reached the point where when Marines came in, it became a military action. Up to that time, most of the operational action was sort of around the corner. It was under the operational control of Central Intelligence Agency. We did some work in India in those days, and again going across what we call the embassy run in Southeast Asia, back into Saudi Arabia, where by that time, 1954, 1955, the oil discoveries there had bloomed into the greatest oil field in the world, and today we certainly recognize the importance of that. So much for laying a little ground rules here, a little background to show that this country began clandestine activities a little tentatively as part of military programs. At the end of the war, the first official action that Truman took in what we used to call the demobilization was the disbanding of the OSS. And in its place, he established what he called the Central Intelligence Group. The Central Intelligence Group was formed by presidential direction simply to bridge the time between the OSS, which was going out of business, and the formation of a Central Intelligence Agency, which is then being discussed by Congress. And any of you who hope to understand the CIA and understand what our country was doing in establishing this organization must go back into the history and look at the discussions, the debates, the arguments of that period, 46, 47. The war had ended. We were, without question, the leading military power in the world. We had the atomic weapons. And yet, all of a sudden, recognizing the power of the atomic weapons and knowing full well that any scientific achievement is simply proof that it can be done, therefore any other scientists and any other engineers can build a weapon, we knew that there was only a certain amount of time before Russia or any other country could obtain and use those weapons if they could work out a means of delivery, and even that wasn't too serious. So much of our thrust for intelligence in those days involved whether or not the Soviet community was gaining the upper hand or was moving up on us, you might say, in the field of atomic energy. With this behind the thrust, and knowing also that in World War II our intelligence community was too separated. The Navy would get intelligence, it wouldn't tell the Army, or the Army would have intelligence, it wouldn't tell the Navy. The FBI was responsible for intelligence in Latin America. The OSS was operating, but the OSS didn't bother much with intelligence, and so on. So there were two great drives. One was to establish a coordinated intelligence system, and the other was to gain all the intelligence we could on the nuclear weapons. Working under this drive, then, Congress put together the law which today prescribes precisely how they wanted the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, organized. Here again, we must be very precise in our interpretations about this law. For example, when Cy Hirsch released this information a little while ago about the thousands and thousands of people that the agency had been tapping or investigating in domestic surveillance, one of the things that Bill Colby came out and said real quickly was, well, we weren't really investigating domestic activities. We were checking on people who were friends of foreigners here in the United States and wanted to see how far they had gone. In other words, opening a door to say that the Central Intelligence Agency is charged by law with protecting its sources and methods. Now, how many times have all of you heard that the Central Intelligence Agency is charged by law with protecting its sources and methods? In fact, they bring people to court for that, for the revealing sources and methods. But if any of you looked that up, do you know that that is not part of the law? The law does not say anywhere that the Central Intelligence Agency is responsible for protecting sources and methods. But ever since Allen Dulles began to build the clandestine side of the agency, they have tried to make people, including most of our senators and most of our members of the House, believe that this is one of the reasons why they become involved, at least peripherally, in the investigation of people here in the domestic scene, to protect sources and methods. Now, what the law does say, and the law was very correct about it, that the director of Central Intelligence, not the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, the director of Central Intelligence, who is also the director of Navy Intelligence or Army Intelligence or State Department Intelligence, is responsible for the protection of sources and methods for a very obvious reason. That if Navy Intelligence uncovers somebody over in this room and Army Intelligence uncovers somebody in that room, and they turn out that both of them are working with somebody in another room, they better tell each other before somebody knocks the other guy's head off. That's a pretty practical reason. But to say that the Central Intelligence Agency is responsible with that is a different part of the machinery entirely, and the law doesn't say that. Well, there are many of these things in this law that we are sort of brainwashed into believing are in the law. One of the senators who is on this committee that is working on the investigation of the agency asked me a while back. He said, what is there about the agency's secret charter that we should know? And how many times have you all heard about that? That there is a charter for the agency that gives them the right to do all these things. And they quote something about being able to do whatever the National Security Council directs them from time to time, and that therefore this gets them into the clandestine business. That isn't the way Congress wrote the law. The law that established the Central Intelligence Agency did it to coordinate intelligence. The agency was created to coordinate the intelligence of other departments and agencies. Congress knew we had intelligence. What it needed was coordination, central coordination. Or as Harry Truman said, I've now got an intelligence arm that can brief me, the president, and I get it all in one place instead of having to go to all the separate ones. That's what the law said. And subordinate to that, there are 5 subparagraphs, but subparagraphs are always subordinate to the main paragraph, and they simply deal in the routine things like printing intelligence, doing things of common concern like running computers. And then that final one that Mr. Dulles made us believe was the catch-all, saying that the agency will do those things which the National Security Council from time to time may direct. I used to have in my files, when I worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the original copy of that paper. And in the margin of that copy, in the personal pencil handwriting of President Eisenhower, was an explanation of what was meant by NSC 5412-2, which some of you may know as the old 10-2, or they used to say the clandestine direction or the secret charter. It wasn't that at all. It was a clarification of this subparagraph which is in the law. And in the margin, Eisenhower had written that anyone who utilized this version of the law was to remember that time to time meant that the agency would have no power consecutively to carry out operations in a continuity. And secondly, that they would carry them out only when directed. And the reason he wrote that on the copy that came to the Secretary of Defense was that when the agency needed the equipment, aircraft, weapons, people, at one time I had the names of more than 7,000 military people and 605 military units that existed in the Defense Department in support of the clandestine activities of the agency. But when these were to be used, it was to be from time to time only, and then specifically by direction of the agency. How different that is from what a lot of people are saying today, even some of them who are well-intentioned about the things that the agency is permitted to do. I call to your attention the current issue of Newsweek. In that issue, on the sheet of the column that is headed My Turn, some gentleman says we should abandon the agency, do away with it, we don't need it. I forgot his name, it's a pretty good article. But in it, he also is stating some of these things that are not so, that make you think that there's a secret charter that we don't know about. I can tell you categorically that other than the law of 1947 and some revisions in 1949 which have mostly to do with pay, retirement, and the handling of money, which is much abused, there is no secret charter. And how can I stand on those words? It was my job for years, for 9 years to be specific, to brief such men as the Secretary of Defense, and many of them, Mr. McElroy, Mr. Gates, Mr. McNamara, and many other senior officers in the Pentagon, on files which had been collected over the years, ever since the original act had been written, and all of the National Security Council papers, and all of what we call today the 40 Committee papers, and any other letters of substance that pertain to the agency. And in those days, 1955, 56, 57, 58, when this business was handled a little more precisely than it is today, there was absolutely no reason at all to shield from the Secretary of Defense anything as important as a secret charter. There is no secret charter. And having said that, then there is nothing but the law. And having said that, then when we investigate CIA, the thing to look for is to ask the agency, what have you done that we're paying you to do? Almost everything else is unlawful. And that's what's important about it, and that's the ground we should stand on. And these committees that are working today should work from that side. That's where the strength is. And all the rest of the things the agency are doing, they could cut the funds off. And if they cut the funds, most of them will come to a halt. But it's important to go back to those basic things. Another thing that committees should look at is the fact that in 1948, President Truman called in 3 gentlemen, Allen Dulles, Matthias Correa, and William H. Jackson. And he established a commission after 1 year of operation of CIA to study the CIA and see how it was performing with reference to the law which had been passed a year earlier. It's a very interesting thing that he did this, because in 1948, especially right in the summer toward the end of the year, he was running against Thomas E. Dewey for re-election. And as most of you remember, the chances of Truman being re-elected were pretty slim. And Mr. Dulles, who was working on this CIA report for Truman, also happened to be the speechwriter of Thomas E. Dewey. Dulles was working under mixed emotions, you can be sure, because he visualized himself as soon as Dewey was elected as being the director of Central Intelligence. He had to wait about 4 more years. The Jackson, Correa, and Dulles report should be surfaced just like many of us this afternoon have said that the Warren Commission work should be surfaced and reopened and restudied. There is no more important document somewhere buried in the files, it's a book, than the Dulles-Jackson Courier report dated 1 January 1949, because that was Alan Dulles' Mein Kampf. That was his instructions to the agency and to the rest of the community what he was going to do in the intelligence area. That was the beginning of organized, worldwide, highly funded clandestine activities. And when he became the Director of Central Intelligence in 1953, after Eisenhower's election, the report, which had lain there for 4 years while Truman ignored it, became the working document, and this, if anything, is the secret charter. But it is not a legal secret charter. It was written by this commission, turned into the president, and later just used without any sanction by Congress or any proper authority. Some of you may recall that when, just before Eisenhower was elected, at the end of Truman's tenure and after the Korean War had started, there was a lot of feeling that the agency had missed the boat, as they did many times, in predicting whether or not there would be a Korean War. Truman replaced the then Director of Central Intelligence with General Walter Beadle Smith. Smith had been ambassador to Moscow. He'd been back shortly. He intended to retire, but he agreed for the rest of Mr. Truman's term to serve as the Director of Central Intelligence. And this was in the pre-Joe McCarty era, when the term red herring or worse were bandied about everywhere. And somebody asked General Smith in the hearings for his nomination and acceptance as the director, if by some chance there were any KGB operators in the Central Intelligence Agency. And General Smith, realist, pragmatist that he was, and just back from Moscow with due respect for the Soviets, said, of course there are. Pretty blew the lid off the Senate. But they said, well, prove it. And he said, you asked me? And he said, I assume there are. I think that current events may cause us to look a little more carefully at what Walter Beadle Smith meant, because some people have scurried out of the agency lately that he might have had in mind. Let me bring things just a little bit up to date, and then I'll close because we have a most interesting program. I'm trying to set a certain perspective. I'm trying to get you to feel that there's a lot of reason for going to the guts and the bones of this affair. It's very interesting and very titillating to talk about things that have happened in various countries, and we could do that forever, and if you want to ask questions, I'll be glad to join in. But I'm trying to stick to basic issues, so I'll close on one. Much is said about the 40 Committee. I've written about it recently, and some of you may have seen the article that I wrote. But what the 40 Committee is a fallout from the days when Mr. Dulles went to his brother, John Foster Dulles, and said, now look, there's no reason why when I have an operation planned, a clandestine operation, I should have to get you, you're busy, or Mr. Wilson, the Secretary of Defense, or Mr. McElroy, and bring them over and have a meeting, or the President and Vice President, in other words, the National Security Council. There's no reason why we should have the most important men in the country tied down every time I want to bring something in and see if I can get approval for clandestine operations. Let's establish a committee. Have somebody from the White House appointed, somebody from State, somebody from Defense, and I'll attend the committee, Alan Dulles. Sound like a pretty logical idea, especially when your brother's a Secretary of State. That gives you 2 votes out of 4, and it went through pretty easy. But look what it did. It destroyed the controls that the Congress had put over the agency. The Congress knew the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State and the President and the Vice President were busy men. And that's why the Congress said that if ever the agency was to be ordered to do something that wasn't specifically covered by the law, it would be done only time to time, and then at the direction of the National Security Council, not somebody else. And that was to keep it from happening often and regularly and irregularly. So in the beginning, they had a little committee they called the 10-2 Committee, and it became the 5412 Committee, and it became the Counterinsurgency Committee, and it became the 303 Committee, and today it's the 40 Committee. All the numbers mean nothing. Well, not nothing, but originally 10-2 was NSC document 10-2 and so on. But later it just got a code name for a group of men who sit down and tell the agency whether or not they have the authority to do this. Now, does it work that way? In my day, if I got a call from Central Intelligence Agency and they said, look, we're sending over a couple of men, we're going to need some aircraft and we're going to need a base to operate from, and we'll probably need some money and some ammunition and some paradrop equipment and so on, we'll come over and explain the mission, I'd say fine. They'd come over, Pentagon, we'd have a little meeting. As soon as the door was shut and they were on their way back to what was then Foggy Bottom, where their headquarters was, I would go right up to the office of the Secretary of Defense, I would get out the log of the 40 Committee. And if that activity was listed there, and if it was listed with full approval, then I would go to the Secretary of Defense and I would say, is this the way you saw that activity when it was presented? And if his representative, the man who had gone, had briefed him on it, or if he had been there personally, he'd give me an answer, yes or no. If it was no, we would not provide the support. In other words, the committee did serve a function as long as it was used that way. But by about 1961, 62, 63, the committee became a rubber stamp and even less. And today the committee works even worse because the senior man on the 40 committee for the White House is the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Kissinger. He still retains the job of the National Security Advisor to the President. Now this puts up a very trying situation, and it explains some of the things that have happened quite recently. Because if you go into your bank someday and you recognize the man sitting behind the desk as a man whose picture you just saw is being put in jail as a robber, doing undercover work, which man do you think you're dealing with, the robber or the banker? Or if you're Indira Gandhi and this gentleman comes breezing in Air Force One, is he there on a clandestine activity or is he there as a Secretary of Defense? And I think this explains the recent characteristics of what has become shuttle diplomacy. Because if you're dealing with people undercover, clandestinely, in things that you can't print and put above board, then you deal with them two at a time, bilaterally. You can't call them all in and say, look, fellas, we've got a problem in the Middle East, let's sit down and talk about it. You run from one to the other to the other. The big error in this kind of thing, the failing in this kind of thing, and of course, saying this today after it has failed so miserably, it's hindsight, but it underscores it, that they all talk to each other. As soon as he leaves Cairo, Cairo calls up Riyadh. As soon as he leaves Riyadh, they all call Tehran. So they call Tehran, they even call Jerusalem, because at least they're all in this thing. And if they get together behind his back, there's no possible chance of negotiation. You see what it does? This clandestine activity wrecks any hope of success. The 40 committee should be abolished. It serves no purpose. We should go back to the law, which strictly says that if clandestine activities must be carried out, then the President or the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State must, in concert, agree with it. And that means there would be very few operations, and they would be limited, and they would be small, and they would be very, very important. Now that's what the law said, and they've gone so far from that that's why we have the problems we have today. I personally do not call for the abolition of CIA. I think we need intelligence, good intelligence. In fact, we have good intelligence, but we've overshot the mark by tenfold in building up the clandestine side, what we call the clandestine side of the house. The budget of CIA is about $750 million. That's a lot of money. But even that is open to question, because it's only a few days ago it was revealed that $350 million of that $750 million went down in the Pacific looking for a submarine. Don't let the figures fool you. There's nearer to $6 billion being spent every year in the name of intelligence, and we all need to look into it. Thank you.
In the second half of this program, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, speaking to an afternoon session of the conference, details the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in political assassination. Fletcher Prouty.
This subject, which I'm going to get into, I might call the anatomy of assassination or the politics of assassination. Assassination is a big business. In fact, assassination is the business of big business. Anatomy of assassinations. It gets you thinking, you know? Well, thank you very much.
There is a many-faceted drive at work to have our state lines eventually mean no more within the nation than our county lines do now within the states.
When freedom is lost, it is lost forever.
We are losing the right to make our own determinations about what we think, what we eat, how we protect our health, how we protect our children, and whether, in fact, we are members of a free society.
The purpose of education in America today is not education. It is indoctrination.
They have to destroy the United States Constitution and our way of life. And they've got to do so in such a way that will actually embrace it. We embrace it.